Good morning. How are we doing today? I heard a couple people say good, and I didn't hear much from anyone else, but I'll take it. Fine. Well, it's a beautiful day, and I feel comfortable in saying that regardless of what it looks like outside, because it's always a pleasure to be gathered here together, to be able to worship together. And sometimes when we gather, it reminds me of things from when I was younger. And some of you are like, what are you talking about? You're young. But I remember just growing up and being a part of a church that had a choir, and before coming here, it's been a while since I'd heard a choir sing on Sunday morning. And at first it was, well, this is neat. And now I'm kind of sad that you guys are going on a summer break, because it's going to be a little while. Was today the last Sunday for the choir? Okay, yeah. So a little bit of a break, and I'm a little bit sad about that, because it's going to be different over the summer, but it'll be a good different as well. But I've really enjoyed having the choir. I've enjoyed the bell choir, and some of these are things that are kind of unique to what we do here at First Union. And that's not to say that there aren't other churches that have choirs or bell choirs, but it's something about being here that just kind of harkens back to maybe a simpler time, maybe a time in the past. And frankly, I'm one to think about these types of things quite a bit. I like to reminisce. Does anyone else here like to reminisce? Like to think about days long past? For me, my life is kind of divided into two very distinct periods, and that's like pre-internet and post-internet. So I spent a lot of childhood not even touching a computer, and then at some point along the way, I don't know how it happened, but suddenly like everything I did had to be on a computer. And thankfully I picked it up quickly, but I know that a lot of you can relate to that struggle of like, why does everything have to be on a computer? Why do I have to talk to robots on the phone? Why can't it just be easy? And sometimes we think back and we remember the way things used to be, and then we do that, we kind of have this tendency to maybe forget about some of the difficult things, or kind of over-accentuate the good things. And I point this out to Brandy frequently when she says things like, I wish we would have another baby. And I was like, oh, you want to stay up till 4 a.m. and, diapers and all of that. And she's like, no, I don't mean that. I just mean like snuggling. And I was like, well, we can find you a baby somewhere to snuggle. Maybe one of those moms that's up at 4 a.m. would let you just come over once in a while, and we wouldn't have to worry about it. But when we think back, when we remember, we kind of have a tendency to think about the good and kind of block out some of the bad. And I think that's overall generally a positive thing, but it's not necessarily realistic. And the reason I bring that up is we're getting ready to go through this transition time in our family, and we're moving into my father-in-law's house, and super exciting. I'm gonna love it. It's going to be great. There's going to be a swimming pool, so the kids are never going to want us to leave, and it'll be great. But in this time of transition, you think about what has been before and what is to come, and there's always uncertainty with that. And our subject for today is someone who's going through a time of transition. And as you remember, we've been going through some of the shortest verses in the Bible, and we started with Jesus wept. Last week we talked about what Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians 5, where he said, pray continually, rejoice always, But today, we're in the Gospel of Luke, the 17th chapter, and in verse 32 of that book, Jesus says, "Remember Lot's wife." And if you're like me, as I was thinking about this, I'm like, this seems like kind of a change. Like, Jesus wept. Like, once we talked about that, like, we understand this is showing, those the hypostatic union of Christ, fully God, fully man, as he was feeling all of those emotions that humans feel, the sorrow, those things that we go through at the loss of a loved one, but then also able to say, "Lazarus, come forth," and Lazarus walked out of the tomb. And last week on Mother's Day, we talked about rejoicing and prayer, those things that mothers do so well, those things that we should do. Remember the good times, praise God in the good times, and continuing to pray. But this week we talk about Lot's wife, and I have a couple of pictures I want to show you this morning to begin. And the first, this is just kind of a rock formation near the Dead Sea in Israel, and this rock formation is known as Lot's wife. It's on Mount Sodom near the Dead Sea, and you can kind of see there's one little just point sticking up there by itself, and that's what they're calling Lot's wife. And if you're not sure why, we'll explain that here briefly. And the next picture is an artistic representation of Lot's wife, and this is at a cathedral in Italy, and you can see there's chaos to the left of the picture, and that's Lot's wife in the middle, and then the rest of her family on the right. So we say, remember Lot's wife, as Jesus says this. Frankly, just those three words are probably a little difficult to understand exactly what Jesus is getting at. So to explain this morning, we're going to go back to the beginning. We're going to go to Genesis, and we're going to start at Genesis, and we're going to work all the way through the Bible up until we get to Luke. Okay, we're not really going to do that, but we're going to hit some highlights of the story and kind of explain what this means. Why is Jesus saying to remember Lot's wife? And if we go back to Genesis 12, we have God calling Abram. This is when God tells Abram, "I want you to leave your home. I want you to leave this place that you have known your whole life. And I want you to trust me. I want you to follow where I tell you to go." So Abram does that. And Abram and his wife Sarai don't have children, so they don't bring the kids along, but they do bring Lot, Abram's nephew. And they go together. They take their employees, they take their livestock, they pack up from their homeland, and they move to follow God. And at first, it goes well. They thrive, they're successful. And then we get to chapter 13, and they split. And what happens is the workers for Lot and the workers for Abram are feuding, they're fighting, because as their livestock is growing, as their flocks are growing in number, they're running out of places to eat, and they're like bickering over who gets to feed their animals in what part of the land. So they decide to split. And in doing this, Abram says to Lot, "I'll let you pick first where you want to go." And verses 12 and 13 kind of tell us the results of that. It says, "Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord." So in this, we see Abram giving Lot his pick, and Lot takes the best land, but it just so happens to be near the city of Sodom, which the verse tells us the city was full of people that were sinning greatly against the Lord. And in chapter 14, we see that Abram rescues Lot. And he's not rescuing him from the city of Sodom, but rather there's an invasion of the city, and Lot is actually picked up and kidnapped and carried away. And Abram goes and he rescues Lot, and he helps rescue the people of Sodom, and the king tries to give him a reward, and Abram says, "No, I don't want anything. because I don't want people to say, I only have success because of what you did. Abram wants to be able to say that his success comes from the Lord. And you can continue in Genesis 15, 16, and 17. There's a lot that goes on. And then we get to Genesis 18, and we see that Abraham pleads for Sodom. So clearly there's a lot that's going on in these chapters. I'm going to encourage you to read it this week or in the days to come to just get an account of everything that's going on. But even in this forward summary, we can see that clearly a lot has changed, because no longer are we talking about Abram, but we're now talking about Abraham. And Abraham is pleading for Sodom. And in this, God has had enough. He has said, I can't allow this to happen anymore. I'm going to destroy the city because of the wickedness that is there. And as Abraham pleads for Sodom, he says, if I find 50 righteous people, will you save the city? And God says, yes. And Abraham's like, well, I kind of know how Sodom is, so what about 45, Lord? And God says, yes. And Abraham's like, well, how about 40? God says, yes. And then 30, and then 20, and finally we get down to 10. If I find 10 righteous people in this city, will you save it? Will you spare it? And God says, yes. And then we look at Genesis 19. Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. Abraham couldn't find 10 righteous people living in the city. And so we look at Genesis 19, in verses 15 through 17, it says this: at the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished. So God sent angels to the city. There's a whole mess that happens there, but these angels are telling Lot to get out of town, get out of here. What are you doing? Go. And when he hesitated, the men grasped his hand in the hands of his wife and of his 2 daughters and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful for them. And as soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, flee for your lives. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you'll be swept away. So Lot and his family are told to flee, to get out of the city, to go. Don't look back. Get out as fast as you can. They're being offered redemption. They're being offered a safe place, and they're being told to go. And then we have verse 26, and it says this: but Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. So as you remember that picture, historically this picture has been representative of Lot's wife, that pillar-like object that was on top of the rock formation. They're saying this is Lot's wife, and they would point to that and they would tell this story, the foolishness of Lot to be near this evil city, the foolishness of Lot to hesitate in getting away, and ultimately the mistake that Lot's wife made by turning back as they were leaving. So when Jesus says, remember Lot's wife, to us, that doesn't carry a whole lot of weight, but when he's saying that to the crowds and to the disciples, the people that have gathered around, they know this story, they know the history, and they know that Jesus is saying, look forward, stop looking back, stop living for what was, put your focus on what I'm teaching you. And the first thing that Jesus is saying when he's saying to remember Lot's wife is, don't long for the past. We see this with Lot first, where he hesitates to leave the city. He has this very clear message to get out of where he is, and yet he's hesitating, and they have to pull him out and lead him to safety. Jesus is saying, don't long for the past. Don't try to hold on to the mess that you found yourself in. And the same for Lot's wife. She was being offered a new start, a new beginning, and she lingered and she looked back. So Jesus says, don't long for the past, but rather learn from it. When we talk about the past, yes, there's things that happened there. I'm sure Lot and his wife and his family had memories there. They had friends there. There's nothing that they could do in that moment. And for us, as we look at the past, we can't go back to the past. We also can't stay stuck in the past. We have to continue to move forward. We have to continue to move closer to Christ. So Jesus is saying, don't long for the past, rather learn from the past. When we look at our lives, see, here's what went wrong. We tried to do things our own way. And we said, God, it's okay. I can handle this one. And we start trusting ourselves rather than trusting God. A lot of times we'll find out that doesn't work. So rather than continuing to fall into those patterns, let's learn from the past and let's trust God. And the next thing that Jesus is saying is lean in. For this, I have another picture that I would like for you to look at. And typically, this isn't something that I would normally reference, but this is a post from Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. And this picture was posted a week ago today by this guy named @TheRoaringKitty. So clearly not his government name. And on this post, if you can see the picture, it's showing someone who was leaned back in a chair, who is now leaning forward. And you might not be able to tell, but he's holding a video game controller in his hand. And at this point, you're asking, what does this have to do with Jesus? And at first glance, it doesn't have much to do about anything. But when people saw this, and based on the reputation that @TheRoaringKitty has, people started buying a certain stock. They were buying GameStop, the video game store. They were just buying tons of stock, and the price tripled from Sunday to the middle of the week. And then the government noticed that's weird, so they slowed things down. And essentially, this picture is a representation of what Jesus is saying when we say lean in. So at first, the guy's playing video games, he's relaxed, he's reclining, but then at that moment, when things get serious, he starts to lean in. And maybe, I'm going out on a limb here, but I don't think there's a lot of video gamers here today. If I'm wrong, please feel free to tell me afterwards, and I would love to play Pac-Man or whatever it is that you enjoy with you at some point. But think about it as when you have a conversation and you start out relaxed, and then maybe the person that you're talking with tells you something that is unbelievable, and you sit up from your chair and you lean in and you lock eyes and you are into the conversation. You are right there with them. That's this idea here. It's no longer being passive and sitting back and relaxing, but rather it's leaning in. And then when we lean in, we pay attention, we pay close attention, we look closer. So Jesus is saying, lean in and look closer. Pay attention to what's going on around you. Pay attention to right now what's happening and what God's doing. Let go of those things from the past. Lean in and look closer to right now. And as we do that, as we look to Jesus, we recognize that he came to give us the example of what we're supposed to do. So much of our lives can be spent wondering, what am I supposed to do next? And it's we want this very clear, precise map that we're supposed to follow. And because we're humans, we would think, well, I know where I'm starting and where the destination is, but I'm going to try to find my own way. And rather than giving us an exact, perfect, do this, eat this for breakfast, wear these clothes type of plan to follow, Jesus became the example of what God's plan is for us. And that example is to love God with all that we have and to love others as we love ourselves. So love God and love people. And that brings us to the third thing that I think Jesus is telling us when he says, remember Lot's wife. So he says, don't long for the past, don't linger there, but rather learn from it as you move forward. And to be paying attention, to lean in, to look closer to what God is doing and what God is calling you to do. And then finally, Jesus tells us to lose our life. In verse 33 of Luke 17, Jesus says this, "Whoever tries to keep their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life will preserve it." Similarly, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 25, Jesus says, "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." And this is one of those things that's kind of a paradox of what Jesus tells us. It doesn't make sense. What does it mean to lose your life? And essentially what Jesus is saying is, rather than trying to hold on to these things that you think are important, that you seem to think are what life's all about, to stop holding those in tightly clenched fists, but rather to open your hands and to offer that to God and say, whatever I have, whatever I am, whatever life I have left is yours. And there's risk in doing that. That's a scary thing to say to God, because a lot of times what God asks us to do seems scary. It seems like too much. It seems like there's no way we could possibly handle that. What Jesus is saying is, lose your life, hand it over to him, and live for him. It becomes our call, our mission to live our lives for Christ. That's the purpose of this Christian life, isn't to simply say, hey, I'm a good person and I went to church on Sunday and I'm friendly and I wave at my neighbors and I wave at people when they drive by. Rather, Jesus is calling us to live for him. And this is a high calling, but it's worth it. Because not only did Jesus come and give his life for us, but rather he also has invited us into being a part of sharing that good news. So when we say, live our lives for Christ, it's this picture of an amazing, incredible partnership where, yes, Jesus did the hard thing. He went to the cross. He died an unjust death after a perfect life. He took the punishment for sin upon himself. He died, he was buried, but then he rose again. He did the hard part, and then we get to tell that. We get to share that. We have the incredible charge to be able to go into the world and say, I know that things are not as they should be, but you are loved. God loves you so much that he sent his son for you. It's a beautiful, incredible thing that we get to be a part of when we look to Jesus, when we stop worrying about all these things that weigh us down and we begin to live for him. This can be a challenging, difficult thing, because every day it seems like we're bombarded with bad news, with people around us that are hurting, or with our own hurts, with our own struggles. It's a hard thing. Sometimes it can be hard to continue going, because all we can do is look back and think things were better, things were easier then. Jesus is saying, remember Lot's wife, who was paralyzed with the thought of leaving behind what wasn't good for her. She was so wrapped up in that she missed what was ahead. In Philippians 1, Paul says this, to live is Christ and to die is gain. As we go through this life, yes, it is hard, but it's also good. We get to enjoy the goodness of God's creation, with the world around us and the beauty that we can see, but also the people that we get to meet and interact with. And Paul says to live is Christ, as I get to be like Christ to these people, and that I'm telling them the good news that God loves them. But we all know that at some point that comes to an end, and Paul says, yes, to live is Christ, but to die is gain. So we have this beautiful experience here on earth, this opportunity to share the goodness and the love of God with people around us, and we know that even as good as it may be on the best day, what lies ahead for us and our everlasting reward is even better. On earth, we get to live for Christ. We get to share and show his love. And then when we come to the end, we gain even more. As we go through this week, remember Lot's wife, not simply for this story of a woman that turned into salt, but rather, let's learn from that. Let's remember to put our past behind us, as those wise philosophers, Timon and Pumbaa, said in The Lion King. Put your past behind you. Keep your focus, keep your eyes on Jesus. To live is Christ, and to die is gain. Let's sing.